What is potassium doing in living things? Why is potassium an important component of nutrition for plant growth? Perhaps the creation of living organisms has not a reason why. Asking how come may be more suitable to logic out what had happened during the mythic creation and evolution of lives on planet Earth. I guess a lot of people today are familiar that compounds of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, or N-P-K in short, are the major compositions of fertilizer for living things of the kingdom of plant. Although I am raised a country boy, the soil in my parents' farm must have been fertile enough that we never have applied anything to enrich the growth of our crops. This is the major reason why I haven't understood the meanings of NPK. My inability to understand the importance of potassium for healthy plant growth lasted long after I have received quite a high level of education in the field related to biology. Very basic knowledge of biology tells us that plants make their own food. An important food for living organisms is proteins, which are made of nitrogen, so the need of nitrogen by plants seems obvious. A further biology study leads us to see that phosphorus is needed to make organic matters such as nucleic acids and energy carriers. Still, why potassium? We understand that food is for growth and minerals are for the health of living things. Potassium is certainly a common mineral in the earth on which plants grow, yet we can't see the reason why potassium has become an essential fertilizer composition, in amounts that are almost as large as those for food. So, how come plants need a lot of potassium? Potassium in cell must start from the ancient time when cells emerged and developed. Firstly, if it is true that the first cells had come from a potassium-rich habitat, such as the puddles at primordial anoxic geothermal fields, the question of why cells have potassium at their internal is easy to understand. However, it seems to be a more general wisdom, perhaps it is factual, that life started in the sea that had a high concentration of sodium salt. Since the early cell membrane was rather ion leaky, sodium must have moved into the cells easily. Thus, living cells from ancient time must have an essentially equal sodium concentration, inside or out. Advancement of life required not only organics but salts to serve the diversity of cells' functions. Ions of salts carry electric charges, which can be used to transmit signals or to trigger designated motor actions. In addition, ion concentration gradients across cell membrane can be, and is indeed, used as a mean to store dynamic energy. To make a concentration gradient across the cell membrane, sodium ions must be either pumped into the cells or pumped out of a cell. However, an ion concentration gradient with either higher or lower intracellular sodium concentration than that outside of a cell would impair the balance of osmotic pressure. Since the compositions of the sea could never be changed, it was simply logical to change only a cell's internal contents. Under this requirement, sodium ion concentration at the cell's interior was lowered to make a gradient pointing inward from the exterior, and a second ion was to fill the cells to maintain osmotic balance. The second ion now had a concentration gradient pointing outward. The two concentration gradients brought to the cells an extra benefit of having two variables that could be programmed, either singly or coupled, to signal or to control various physiological functions. From the time this two-ion system was completed, a 2D domain vastly increased the cell's capability to drive multifaceted of functions required by living things at their stages of evolution. For life forms of later development, such as the multicellular, the two-variable scheme was even more useful. Today we even see the three-ion mechanism in actions in the living cells and tissues. For example, animals have sodium, potassium, and calcium to drive the motor machinery of the muscles. Whether it was the puddle or the sea, the water from which living cells lived and evolved could not be scarce of potassium. Compared to sodium, potassium also has a single positive charge, and its size is only a little larger. To become the second ion to fill the cell's interior, potassium must have been, naturally and inevitably, the priority choice. Summarizing the above, it is safe to say that, since the very early time, cells of multicellular organisms had a relatively high potassium concentration internally. This sodium and potassium ion system can still be found today in the cells of animal. Animal cells have sodium-potassium pumps that keep intercellular concentration of sodium low and potassium high. By strategic in and out movements of sodium and potassium, osmotic pressure across the cell membrane is maintained. Also, by maneuvering this sodium-potassium charge potential, the animal tissue motor actions are signaled and driven. What about plant? Evolution of plants brought them to land. Unlike animals, plants do not need to move, and a charge potential across the membrane of plant cells is no longer needed. This means sodium, the ion that was usually outside a cell, can be absent, and land plants are happy to live without sodium on the outside of their cells. But what about the inside of plant cells? Ancestral setting had potassium filled the cell's internal. It makes sense that potassium remains the ion inside plant cells. Otherwise, the reasoning of why evolution of plants had changed their intracellular cation from potassium to others must become a sizable conundrum. But even though plant cells mustn't have a motor duty, they must maintain rigidity so that stems stay upright, leaves spread wide, and roots penetrate into earth. This rigidity is achieved by maintaining a high water pressure inside the cells. The pumping of water inward to maintain a high internal pressure is driven by a hypertonic osmotic pressure, which is attained with a high intracellular potassium ion concentration. From the time potassium was chosen to be the intracellular ion, cell membranes of plant are installed with potassium channels. There are no sodium channels, so sodium cannot move inside. Additionally, extracellular sodium simply disrupts the required internal osmotic pressure set up with potassium. As a result, plants have no place for sodium, and it is often considered toxic to most plant species. Most plants do not perform local motion, but a particularly important motor movement for all plants is to breathe. Stoma is the breathing orifice on leaves. The opening and closing of stoma work by letting potassium in or out of stoma guard cells, so that water is concomitantly driven in or out by the changes of osmotic pressure. To open the stoma, potassium fills the guard cells, brings water in, and makes a high water pressure. Stoma guard cells are stiffened to form an opening. To close, potassium leaves the guard cells, brings water out, and makes a low water pressure. Stoma guard cells wilt to close the orifice. Cytoplasmic streaming, or the movement of cell organelles, does happen in the cells of some plants. Its driving force and mechanisms is complex and not elucidated here. Finally, we may just be relaxed about how come potassium must be supplied for plant growth. It is nothing other than nature. Potassium has a prominent role as an essential fertilizer component, because today's agriculture practices grow and harvest crops at a very high turnover rate. The crops uptake potassium much faster than the rate by which soil is able to release available potassium. I hope this explanation lightens the quest you may have about why potassium is for plants. Thank you very much for your attention. Goodbye.